welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varnblock, and we continue our discussion of Alvin W. Gouldner's The Two Marxisms. We are into the second section, which is the breakdown of the two Marxisms, critical and scientific. And for those of you who have the original 1980 MacMillan publication, we are on page 40. Under a section called Cognitive Styles. Gouldner so far has broken down into basically scientific Marxism, which is mostly structural Marxism with a few other groups added in. He's seen it as anti-Hegelian, which I think is a mischaracterization. That is true of post-Althusserian structural Marxism, but a lot of scientific Marxism was not anti-Hegelian at all. In fact, insisted pretty emphatically on understanding the science of logic. Lenin and Stalin definitely did. And while Lenin is all over the place on the scientific and critical Marxism, Stalin's pretty much in the scientific camp, even if his conclusions aren't scientific by our modern standards in many ways. Anyway, let's pick this back up. Cognitive styles. The structuralist propensities of scientific Marxism express themselves as a cognitive style that sees objects as having hard-edged boundaries with little or no commingling with different objects. Different objects are neatly assigned to different categories, and the criteria of categorization stresses the unambiguous assignment of an object to one and only one category, generally devaluing the ambiguous rather than seeing it as valuable under certain conditions. For example, in William Epson or Kenneth Burke. Critical Marxism's cognitive style, however, does not view objects as hard-edged, de-emphasizing the dichotomous notions of infra and superstructures, and invoking the totality in which the boundaries among objects are blurred. It avoids carefully graded ranks and hierarchies, each having its distinct Apollonian separation from the other, which is a preference of scientific Marxism, but has a more mythical impulse towards oneness, communion, the Dionysian. All right, Gouldner. You're implying Nietzschean categories to a binary. And you've thrown mythic at critical Marxism. Now, as a meta-Marxist approach, this fails. There's not much meta-Marxist about this. You're using broad cognitive styles here, and I'm not sure that I buy it, buddy. I have been convinced about a lot of your criticism so far, and even been somewhat impressed in your voluntarism versus determinism as a long-standing problem to human thought, not just in Marxism and how it shows up in Marxisms in particular, but it's way older than that. Even in ancient philosophy, you use Greek, but we could easily talk about ancient Indian and ancient Buddhist philosophy for similar complicated notions on determinism of our free will, etc., on like notions of how karma actually works. Pretty big debates in Abhidharmic philosophy, are in the various Hindu schools of philosophy, are in the Tao, etc. Take your pick. I'm not familiar enough with Africana philosophy or with many American indigenous tribes to speak to that, but I suspect that it's an emergent human problem that you find there as well. But talking about Dionysian versus Apollonian styles, because one revels in ambiguity while the other revels in clear categories, doesn't really so much hold. One, because, I mean, even in Althusser, these categories actually do shift into each other. But anyway, I'll pick back up, but I'm skeptical on this claim, Gouldner. I talk to you as if I don't realize you're dead. Scientific Marxism's cognitive style then evinces the presence of a low tolerance for ambiguity. Critical Marxism style rejects formal hard-edged categorization as a vivisection that mutilates and distorts living reality. I would love for you to cite people actually doing that so we can be a little bit more nailing it down than talking about two very broad tendencies. The central problematic around which the distinction in cognitive styles expresses itself in scientific Marxism tendency to divide the socio-cultural world of objects and events into two basic structures: the economic infrastructure centering on the mode of production, and the superstructure involving the ideological and the state, with a firm insistence that the former controls the latter in the long run. That comes from Engels, but it is important to remember that the mode of production is dependent on relations of production which are within it, which I do think the base and superstructure metaphor still applies, but they're not so much an opposition, but a dialectically spinning feedback loop, of which the base is the more important. It's more heavier rated, but some things that we consider superstructural probably aren't, because they inform the relations of production, and that has ties to law, etc. In contrast, critical Marxism's tendency is to reject the economist division of the social world as a vulgar simplification, to stress the totality, and to argue that those using the economy have unduly narrow conceptions of the elements that enter either side of it. Thus, in this vein, Russell Jacoby remarks that what needs to be avoided is, as it were, the vulgar critique of vulgar Marxism. The mere addition of political superstructure component of political economy has lost its politics, may yield only a pureless formula. The rejection against vulgar Marxism is not that it overemphasizes the role of the economy, but conceived it too narrowly. And that's from The Dialectic of Defeat. It's a good book. You should read it. In a similar view, it has been claimed that the state has been too narrowly conceived by other Marxists. The state, capitalized, is much more than its manifestation apparatuses of coercion. The state is all activities employed by the ruling class to secure the collective conditions of production. What then is not the state? And that's a Althusserian thing, and this is how Althusserians kind of collapse civil society and the state altogether. I actually see some of your critiques of the overabundance of the civil society as being totally cut off from the state, but as a good person who sees modes and relations of production as fundamentally tied to each other, I don't need ideological and state apparatuses expanding to everything and becoming the absolute manifestation of the state for that to be true. And by the way, that last quote is Althusser, I believe. All right, evolutionism and catastrophism. Scientific and critical Marxism, however, do not differ only in their epistemologies, styles of cognition, and modes of analysis and interpretation of the social world. They also differ in ways they deliberately seek to change the world and their conceptions of natural social change. Since it accents the density of social superstructure in the word history, to use Montepalli's phrase, scientific Marxism sees the social world as difficult to deflect in course, and thus unchangeable by mere will. Indeed, scientific Marxism sees the social world as imposing itself on persons rather than being a fluid medium open for human intervention. Critical and scientific Marxism also differ then in their politics and the conception of revolution and how it is made, and vitally in their vision of what is to be brought about into existence, the imaginations of what socialism is, no less than their conceptions of capitalism and its pathologies. I mean, this is fair enough, although I think if we try to deal with someone like, say, EndNotes, is it a critical is it critical post-Marxism or scientific post-Marxism? It relies on analytic Marxism, something that was around by the time Gouldner was writing, and I would definitely consider it in the scientific camp, except that it abandons a lot of Marxist categories even more thoroughly than the Althusserians do. The Althusserians just want to chop off part of Marx to make their dependence of certain key texts neater. All right. Marx employed two concepts of change, one gradualistic, evolutionary, and continuous, and the second more discontinuous, abrupt, and catastrophic. The first is largely scientific Marxism's conception of historical change, and it's coincident with Darwinism. So Bernsteinism would be a variety of scientific Marxism by this. See, we're already seeing, I think Gouldner has a lot of good points here. But Ernst Bloch's warm and cold streams, which interact and intersect, make a lot more sense than this hard dichotomy, which doesn't really hold. There are scientific Marxists who are a decline of the rate of profit the fallest who very much think that that'll bring it about. Anyway, the second is more nearly how critical Marxism focuses on historical change and is grounded to Hegel. The conception of change held by both scientific and critical Marxism differ primarily in the first Darwinistic view of object-centered, addressing the changes in a series of natural forms, i.e. evolutions of modes of production. This is me talking. The need for the development of forces, etc. Although, again, that's not true in Althusser. But like Dungism is based on this. Addressing the changes in the series of natural forms, while the second partly involves the activity of knowing subject and the corpus of knowledge. Hegel's notion of contradiction involving an Aufhebung, in which the later incorporates the parts of the earlier form, which is synthesized a new, more encompassing whole, embodies a specific concept of progress. But Dungish used that actually to justify their dependence on markets and whatnot. Again, this seems to be freezing the battles between Althusserianism and like the British Marxist tradition or the humanist or Lukács and the Frankfurt School or whomever in amber, and not dealing with the way these actually manifested in Chinese and Russian communist thought. Maybe he does later, though, because he does talk about this in terms of Cuba later on, so we'll see. The concept of progress is that all that is true or still of value in the past is carried forward and preserved in a new object, so that one needs is the most recent or modern form, since it employs and transcends the truth of the past. And the Hegelian notions of Aufgehoben, having a new object thus allows to drop an old one, to cease honoring it, indeed to forget it, a rupture with the past is inserted. Critical and scientific Marxists also differ in the way in which Marxism relates to the surrounding culture. Those defining Marxism as a science naturally link it to science and technology more broadly into institutions on which these depend. They are more disposed to assume that science and technology, i.e. the forces of production, are central to defining the essential character of the modern world as linked with efforts at modernization and define the nucleated and that are nucleated with science. Except Althusserians don't do this. I mean, they try to do this, but they don't actually do it. Critical Marxists, however, connect Marxism to a very different layer of culture, a more humanistic culture that preceded modern science and technology, and which itself feels to be older and more fundamental than science and technology. Critical Marxism is linked to the humanistic culture, not without which its own forms of arrogance maybe in fact feel that they have been improperly displaced by a parvenu shallow science. A basic difference between scientific and critical Marxism is to be found there in their relationship to what Robert Redfield once called the Great Tradition, which is contrasted with the little tradition of folk and peasant cultures. Both critical and scientific Marxism are bearers of the great tradition of European culture, each connected with more closely, however, with a different aspect of it. Scientific Marxism is oriented towards modern technology and science and accepts the great value placed upon them, whereas critical Marxism is oriented towards the order humanistic, more literary and more philosophical aspects of Europe's great tradition. Stated differently, scientific Marxism is grounded in more instrumental culture and is part of the tradition of which is valued not so much for itself, but what it can bring about, whereas critical Marxism, however, is oriented more strongly towards the transcendental aspects of Europe's great tradition, the basic goals and values that is long prized. This is Varna interjecting here. This is true if your example of critical Marxism is only Lukács and Horkheimer, and even with Lukács, this is kind of a broad overgeneralization. Put in other and older terms, scientific Marxism is concerned with technical civilization, whereas critical Marxism is more concerned with the preservation of culture. Scientific Marxism sees technical modernizations, and critical Marxism aims at moral reinvigoration that may even be discontinent with technical modernization. I'm pretty sure he's thinking of the dialectic of enlightenment. It is for this reason that critical Marxism is closer affinity with Hegelian views. For the latter, as I will suggest, is a kind of secular Protestantism that stresses the importance of sectarian inevitable conviction and authentic belief, contrasting to the invidiously with the positivity of the churchly reliance upon institutional forms, i.e., merely behavioral conformity. Significantly, no one has stressed Hegel's critique of positivity more emphatically than the critical Marxist George Lukács in his study of the young Hegel. Yeah, this really kind of breaks Marxism down to its philosophical tradition as expressed in the structural humanist and anti-humanist debates of the 1970s, which I think is slightly ameliorated. I found the application of that in the last section to be more interesting than here in this cognitive styles and evolutionary catastrophism section, because interestingly in this evolutionary catastrophism section he actually didn't mention the catastrophe part. We're going to stop here with Gouldner. I found this section a little bit more frustrating. Hopefully you'll check it out.